Thank you. I always love returning here. I'm sure that many of you know how special a place the University of Francisco Marroquín is. I was fortunate enough to know Manuel Ayau. He was a very inspiring figure to me, continues to be a very inspiring figure to me. I wish there was more Manuel Ayaus. I hope some of you are the next Manuel Ayau when you come to the United States and revolutionize education there, because we could use it. I was tasked with talking about the relationship between Austrian economics and public choice. I'll get to the punchline and then work my way to it, which is that public choice is derivative from the Austrian school of economics. Just to put it as a historical fact, Buchanan and Tulloch, when Buchanan wrote his doctoral dissertation and the studies that they both did at Chicago, the Austrian school at that time was not considered a separate school of economic thought from the University of Chicago. There literally was just good economics and bad economics. But part of the curriculum was learning what Mises and Hayek had to say and what Böhm-Bawerk had to say. If you look at Milton Friedman's core course in microeconomics, which was taught by Jacob Weiner, there's more pages in that from Böhm-Bawerk's Capital and Interest than there is from Marshall's book, okay? And so the Austrian school was just simply part of what was called the common knowledge of economics. What does it mean to be an economist? It meant that you studied individuals and their interaction and the institutions within which those interactions took place. So you can find that in Adam Smith, you can find that in John Stuart Mill, you certainly can find it in Karl Menger and Böhm-Bawerk and Mises and Hayek, and you can also find it in Marshall and Frank Knight. And so they were just doing good economics. It's only after the 1930s that things start to get a little bit more refined. And you have a development of economics which is too aggregate, pushing away from the individuals and talking instead about, aggregate variables. So one way to think about this philosophically is the nature of the primitive changed. So in the earlier period of time, the primitives were the individual choices and constraints, and the outcomes were things like employment and inflation and the business cycle, as opposed to now where the aggregate outcomes like employment level or inflation rate became the primitive. And then you had to have a science that studied those things. They weren't outcomes, they were the things that you started with. I hope that makes sense. Anyway, I didn't mean to go too derailed on that. So the Austrians are methodological individualists. Buchanan and Tulloch were methodological individualists. The Austrians were subjectivist. Buchanan and Tulloch were subjectivist. The Austrians are market process theorists, meaning that they study exchange and the institutions within which exchange takes place. Buchanan and Tulloch were exchange theorists. Politics is exchange. If you go to any public choice website, you're going to see this voting model that's ticked off, 3 boxes on a diagonal, okay? And if you look further, they'll have names associated with each of the boxes. When Buchanan was the president of the Southern Economic Association, the few years after following the calculus of consent, both he and Tulloch wanted to start a praxeological division within the Southern Economics Association. If you read the calculus of consent, in the very beginning, when they talk about the methodological approach that they pursue, they're going to call it praxeology. We're pursuing a praxeological approach to politics. So the relationship is one that's very intimate, has long historical ties, but there's also going to be nuances of difference, and I'll get to that in a little bit. But what I wanted to sort of capture your imagination about is as follows. That is the need to have a revolution in thought between the years 1950 and 2000, let's say, or 2025. And the reason for that was that we lost something in our economics. So the great economist Lionel Robbins, who was at the London School of Economics, he was a department chairman that hired Hayek to come to the London School of Economics. He wrote a book called The Theory of Economic Policy in British Classical Political Economy. And it wasn't published until 1952 because of a paper shortage. But he wrote it in 1930s. But his main argument is that think about people who you may have met outside of the university or wherever who are critics of Adam Smith, right? They'll argue things like Adam Smith, sort of said greed works, unqualified, right? Adam Smith doesn't care about society. He only cares about the individual, right? All kinds of various things like that. And so what Robbins was trying to point out was that ain't the Adam Smith you read, right? The Adam Smith that you read in the Theory of Moral Sentiments or the Adam Smith that you read in The Wealth of Nations is not one that's characterized by that. He never taught us that economics takes place inside of a vacuum. Economics always takes place within very specific institutional context. Those contexts are defined by law, politics, and society, which means the informal norms and mores and whatnot of people. So you have to study politics, you got to study law, and you got to study, basically society or social norms, conventions, morality in order to be able to do economics. You can't treat economics as if it exists in a vacuum. So why did Robbins have to actually sort of, get us to think about that? Moreover, let's even go further. I mentioned Milton Friedman earlier, or I mentioned Chicago School, Milton Friedman. Read Milton Friedman's, before Milton Friedman is Milton Friedman. This is one of the things everyone forgets about Mont Pelerin. They look at Mont Pelerin, this is when I first got involved in Mont Pelerin, everyone's like, oh my God, everyone's old. Like they're really old, right? And if you look at the selection mechanism was designed to only select old people. So it was like, you had more, obituaries than you had, new members, what was going on. And when I became president, one of the things that I kept on stressing to everyone is you do realize when the society was founded, Milton Friedman was an assistant professor. Do you understand? He wasn't Milton Friedman here. He is Milton Friedman that was an assistant professor that actually struggled to get a job. All right, it's not like Milton Friedman was handed a job with gold. He actually had to fight for a job. He had to leave University of Wisconsin because they had a quota on Jewish, faculty, and he got the job at Chicago. He was not the first choice. It was split decision between Stigler and Samuelson, and then Friedman was the default, one that they got in. So Friedman, but yet Friedman obviously is a wizard, right? He's unique. If you haven't watched any of his Free to Choose videos, I recommend that you do so right away. Man had an amazing set of gifts. In 1947, he reviews Abba Lerner's book, The Economics of Control. Abba Lerner, by the way, wrote that book, was his dissertation under Hayek at the London School of Economics. It shows you how open Hayek is actually to intellectual ideas, because his book is a criticism of Hayek, but yet it was written under Hayek's direction. He says that the problem with Lerner is not that any of his analysis is logically flawed. It's that, and this is the quote, he lacks studying the administrative costs associated with implementing the policy. And this is the first time Friedman makes his famous long and variable lag argument, which is why he argues for rules versus discretion later on. But he's very young when he makes this argument already. But note what he's saying. He's saying, look, you can't do economics unless you take into account the political context within which economic policy gets made. If you don't take that into account, you're going to just be talking about irrelevancies. All right, now, why does all this matter? Is because by mid-20th century, what had happened was that there was a radical transformation in the nature of public administration. Prior to the progressive era, all right, public administration did not have standing bureaucracies, did not have professionalized experts. Had other issues. You might complain about the spoils system or whatever. That's where you think about machine politics or whatever. But to face that, they decided that what they were going to do was professionalize the bureaucracy. Nowadays, we're so used to it. It's 100 years. So we're like, It must have always been there, but it wasn't there. Federal Trade Commission found it, in the early part of the 20th century, all the way up to the EPA. All of these organizations were created as independent regulatory agencies, and they needed to be staffed by who? Economists that were going to be able to do the analysis. But that analysis wasn't what took place from Adam Smith to John Stuart Mill, right? Like, you needed to have like the equivalent of engineering. So you had a new transformation of what the task was, and the science had to meet the task. So the science of economics was born, and it transformed itself from political economy to economics. And the goal, or what was considered to be the goal, was to have an economics that looked just like any of the other engineering sciences, because we were going to use economic science as a tool of social control, not as a philosophical tool of social understanding. Adam Smith's butcher, baker, and brewer already were producing the dinner that you were enjoying. What Smith was asking you to do is reflect philosophically on how that dinner got there. By the time we get to the 1930s, we economists are supposed to orchestrate the dinner. In this case, full employment. Rather than the individuals in the economy themselves, the economist expert is now going to do it. And to be that expert, I need to have certain tools. In order to have that, I moved away from plausible reasoning of if-then, right, to demonstrative reasoning of QED. Because if I'm going to control people, I better have proofs. In order to make those proofs in that transition, I had to get rid of certain things that were annoyances, right? What was one of those things? How about entrepreneurs? Because entrepreneurs do things other than what people want them to do. So I'm going to get rid of a system which has entrepreneurs in it. I'm going to get rid of all of those things, because in order to do that, that's the only way I can end up by having a determinate outcome. And it's the determinate outcome that I need to have to be able to do the policy control. And so economics over the period from 1900 to 1950 became increasingly an economics of social control. In fact, even look at Abel Lerner's title of his book, The Economics of Control. What happened is that they got all the way done with this, and there was an achievement gap. This is why understanding the Great Depression is such a big thing, because part of what he shows is that the government policies didn't get us out of the Great Depression. All right, and the wartime socialization didn't increase productive yields and all of these kind of things like that. So it's a misnomer, and that's why, because they mismeasured the economic productivity during the war, that's why they thought there was going to be this tremendous recession after the war, which was called secular stagnation thesis, and it turned out to not happen. We instead had a post-war boom because we returned things to the market rather than just keep military production going on. Anyway, Higgs is really valuable in this, but there's this achievement gap that economists faced. And in the face of that achievement gap, we started to resurrect institutions back into economics. Armin Altschuan told us that property rights matter. Why the hell did we need Armin Altschuan to tell us property rights matter? Aristotle told us in his Critique of Plato, right? So it's one of the oldest arguments in intellectual history. Why did it have to be rediscovered? Well, it had to be rediscovered because economics as a science had pushed that out in order to get the QED. So now all of a sudden, Altschuan's bringing it back. Gordon Tullock had to point us out that businessmen lobby to try to get favor from the government to protect them against competition from other businesses. Why did I need Gordon Tullock to tell me that? Adam Smith tells us right in The Wealth of Nations, businessmen seldom meet but to conspire to fix the price. Who else told us? The greatest satire in the history of economics, both left and right acknowledged, is by Bastiat, and it's his petition by the candlestick makers to the government to protect them from the unfair competition of the sun. Economists across the ideological spectrum looked at Bastiat's article and said, wow, how amazing is that? It's so hilarious, and it's so true. So why did Gordon Tullock have to resurrect rent-seeking? All right? Why did Ronald Coase have to tell us that we had to pay attention to legal structures? Why did Jim Buchanan have to tell us that we had to pay attention to politics? Buchanan's dissertation is based on the idea that you cannot do public finance unless you do political theory, because it's political theory that dictates whether or not what's right and wrong by the use of compulsion by the state. So you got to do political theory to decide what is the extent of public goods that you need to provide, all that, before you start figuring out what it is, how you're going to go about financing them. Buchanan's great contribution was to also flip that. You can't do political theory unless you do public finance, because you might dream of being able to achieve all kinds of things, but how the hell are you going to get the resources to be able to achieve them? So these things go together, just like they did from Adam Smith to John Stuart Mill, and how they did in Hayek, okay, who's at a parallel time and before these guys are doing this, right? So Hayek writes The Road to Serfdom. Hayek writes The Constitution of Liberty. Both of those are published before the public choice revolution takes place. Armin Alchin was going to go study with Hayek, but the war broke out. But Hayek wrote The Road to Serfdom. How did economists at his age view The Road to Serfdom? They thought he had left economics and got into political science. Hayek never left economics. He was digging at the institutional founding of it. He's the first public choice theorist. He's trying to understand collective action issues. And that's what he's doing in that whole period of time, understanding the way in which collective action operates. How did these classical thinkers and these thinkers think we could handle the politics of things? Remember, the Friedman point about the administrative cost. So the great Scottish Enlightenment thinker David Hume said that whenever we design a system of government, we must design it as if everyone was a knave. Not that everyone is a knave, but I have to design it as if they're knaves because I want to guard against their knavery. So in Hume's version of knavery, you're opportunistic with guile. You're going to cheat whenever you have the opportunity. You see an opportunity to cheat, you're going to cheat. In Adam Smith's view of the knave, it's arrogance, the man of systems who envisions that he can control people like so many pieces on a chessboard, the statesman who can presume that he understands how individuals, could invest their capital better than they could. So what you have in both is both an opportunism with guile and an arrogance of the fatal conceit. And so the point from Adam Smith and David Hume up to Hayek was to build a system of government that was robust against knaves. And by doing so, you can allow all to be free rather than only the best and the brightest to be free. So the punchline of this sort of classical liberal political economy was ordinary people can achieve extraordinary things if just given the freedom. Not extraordinary people, the experts, can achieve extraordinary things, full employment, if given the power. See the difference in those perspectives? This is all the common ground between the Austrians and the public choice people. Right? This is the basis of that common ground. And so, political economy mid-20th century needed to both bring the market back in. That's in the form of the writings of Mises and Hayek and Kerzner. And it had to bring politics back in. And that's in the form of the writings of Buchanan and Tullock. So we could also include Dick Wagner and Randy Holcomb as in that idea as well. So, but in doing that, again, back to my point about praxeology, Mises stressed the universal applicability of the science of human action. So science of human action didn't just apply to market transactions, but took place in all of our human endeavors, from the most mundane to the most sacred. You can explain it in terms of the logic of means-ends analysis. So public choice is literally just the application of praxeology to the realm of politics. And by the way, you know, so like in the book that Clinton mentioned, Living Economics, and if you go to the UFM YouTube site and you look at the mural, you'll see it's called Mainline Economics Mural. That terminology comes from me. It was an effort to try to explain the commonality. So the subtitle of the book is Living Economics, economics for yesterday, today, and tomorrow. And the idea was, what is the continuity in economics and what is the discontinuity in economics? And, I've been thinking about this for a while, but when I was here, I saw that mural and it really made me think about the issue quite a lot. Because here's what I kept on thinking every day. How does someone get up on there? And how come others aren't on there? Right? Like, it's not just a history of all those who have ever talked about economics. Like, it must be a rationale for why you selected the people to go up there and why they didn't. Now, so I invented my own selection criteria. It's not the one that went to the mural, but I invented my own selection criteria. And that selection criteria was as follows. It's for all those thinkers that derive the invisible hand proposition from the rational choice postulate, but via institutions. When you are reading standard economics and you're learning the models, let's say, to go from intermediate micro to graduate level micro, in order to get the demonstrative proofs, they have to make rather heroic assumptions about the frictionless nature of the context and the cognitive capacity of the actors, right? When you draw like a indifference curve tangentially kissing a budget constraint and you write that down formally, that means something. When you say max utility subject to constraints, it means something cognitively, okay? So if you have that frictionless environment and you have cognitive agents that have great cognitive capacities, the rational choice postulate, the invisible hand proposition, is just bibbling and scribbling from the rational choice postulate. It just follows naturally. There's no, if you can do the one, you get the other. There's no intervening process that brings it about. So if I'm a critic of that, what do? I deny that people are rational. Okay, that's the first thing. That's called behavioral economics, but it also is in John Maynard Keynes. Right? When you learn about Keynes and you learn the basic core Keynesian model, the Keynesian cross, you are going to learn that investment behavior has no reaction to a price. It's based on a psychological concept of, the sort of the spirits, the animal spirits. Okay? Investment is a function of the animal spirits. The dark forces of time and ignorance ensnare us and don't allow us to actually calculate our way through. Okay. Behavioral economics today, Keynesian economics in the past. People aren't rational. Price system doesn't do its job because of externalities, because of all kinds of imperfections. And therefore, you can't get the invisible hand from the rational choice postulate. So on the one hand, the invisible hand follows trivially from the rational choice postulate. On the other hand, they're split. You can't get them. But what about the argument, say, for example, against socialism? If everyone was an omniscient agent and they were benevolent, socialism would produce exactly what the invisible hand would want, right? Except it could then redistribute differently. But it would produce the same production efficiency, all right? What's the argument? They can't achieve that because they can't engage in calculation. Why can't they engage in calculation? Because they don't have a basis in private property rights. They don't have a basis in private property rights. They don't get the prices in terms of exchange. You don't have the terms of exchange. You don't have relative prices. Relative prices serves as guides. All right, you don't have the lure of profits, you don't have the penalty of loss. As a result, you can't rationally calculate what the alternative use of resources are. If you want to really get down to basics and think about this, just write down, you do this as a homework assignment, write down the present value calculation that you learn in Finance 101, like how to do a present value calculation. And then ask yourself, what are all the background institutional conditions that must hold for that to be true? Like, say, for example, if you could invest and you have a present value calculation, but someone can bop you on the head and take whatever you get from it, what does that do to your calculation? So we're assuming secure property rights. How about if the government will privatize your profits but socialize your losses? Right? What will happen to your calculation? It will change, right? Because of the moral hazard problem. What if I have volatile bouts of inflation? What is that going to do to your calculation? It's going to render it meaningless, right? So think about all the background conditions that are required just to do a simple present value calculation, and then envision all of the kind of background assumptions. What I'm asking you to do, and what people from David Hume and Adam Smith Forward asked you to do, was think about what are the consequences of a system of property, contract, and consent. Hume argued that you couldn't get society off the ground unless you had property, contract, and consent. Again, you might think, oh, that seems a little weird, but then do the thought experiment of what the world looks like without that. So you don't have stability of possession, you don't have transfer by consent, and no one keeps their promises. Well, we know what that looks like because Thomas Hobbes told us what that looks like. Life would be nasty, brutish, and short. So Hume is 100% correct. You can't get off the ground unless you have stability of possession, transference of those possessions by consent, and the keeping of promises. Again, what have I just been talking about? The political, legal, and social and cultural mores that embed all of our activities. So non-market factors that make the market work. That all got lost and had to be rediscovered. And so the rediscovery, that takes place is going on in the period between 1950 and 1980. It ends up, by the way, of being an extremely successful research program scientifically, because you get Hayek winning a Nobel Prize, Buchanan winning a Nobel Prize, Ronald Coase winning a Nobel Prize, Douglas North winning a Nobel Prize, Elinor Ostrom winning a Nobel Prize, all who were working in this area of how do I explain social cooperation as the outcome of individual choices via various institutional arrangements. So it's not like it was like an outlier scientific research program. It was actually at the core of economics in many ways. So where would there be a difference? So here's the issue. Again, remember what I said about teaching economics and common knowledge? Like, what was common knowledge for an economist in 1930 or whatever, or 40, versus what's common knowledge in 1980 or 2000? It's a huge difference. Like, if you're an MIT economist in 1920, that's different from being an MIT economist in 2020, right? They're different. If you were a Martian and you came and you talked to them, or let's just use Harvard. I don't think MIT had a program in 1920, but use Harvard if you went and did that. All right. Part of the reason why Harvard, for example, had a bad name, not Harvard, but laissez-faire economics had a bad name, is because the leading laissez-faire economist in the United States at one point was a guy named Thomas Nixon Carver. He's very good, but he also happened to be a eugenicist. And so his notion of how you fix the problem of poverty is that you have alignment of 10 people and you just get rid of the bottom 2, and then everyone will be better off. And in that classroom, not videotaping you, but in that classroom listening, were people like Walter Lippmann, the liberals, rising progressives, hear Carver do that. They don't care about any of his nuanced discussions of price system or anything like that. They're hearing him do that, and they're like, but he was a professor at Harvard. Right? That was the common knowledge, right, of economics, was, the nature of how markets work and everything like that. Veblen, for example, was the one that was the outlier. He was the one who struggled to have an academic life. right? He for a variety of reasons, but it wasn't like he was the mainstream of economics, even when he was at Chicago. So, by 1950 to 1980, people like Buchanan and Coase and Hayek were the ones that were the outliers. They were the ones that were not practicing the mainstream of science. So, okay, so common knowledge matters a lot of how we think about economics. It also matters philosophically. Prior to the 1950s, what it meant to do positive social science, right? Positive analysis was you treat ends as given, you treat means as chosen, and you limit yourself as a social scientist to the examination of the efficacy of those chosen means to those given ends. All right? Note, in Mises and Hayek, they are not Ayn Rand. They don't criticize socialism for its collectivism. They don't criticize socialism for its egalitarian goals. Their criticism is, given those goals, and now you've selected these means, collective ownership over the means of production, can those means obtain those goals? And they show that due to incentives and for sake of ease right now and information problems, they're unable to achieve those goals. It's an imminent criticism. And that's what Weberian positive social science was supposed to do. That's what it meant to do positive science. Means, ends. So in this sense, economics is a tool not only of social understand how the butcher, the baker, and the brewer produce our dinner for us, but I also as a tool of social criticism. Not of control, but of criticism. To who? The would-be controllers. Okay? So that's how economics was understood. Then Milton Friedman came along, and he changed the meaning of positive economics. And the meaning of positive economics is we no longer care about the realism of assumptions. What we care about is the hypothesis testing. So what it means to do positive social science is to submit your hypotheses or conjectures to refutation through empirical analysis. Okay. The Austrians, since they are working in the older version, never imputed nefarious goals to the politicians as the explanation for why it is that there was an achievement gap. All right, so remember what I said before. Whole reason why this becomes a question is because there was a promise, there was a delivery, and there's a puzzle. Why was there an achievement gap? Right? It's similar like when you look at the hockey stick of human history, it's a puzzle, right? You had McCloskey here recently. She used to do the following thing. She would walk across, the stage and she would go, whoop! Right? Now, why would she do that? Because your attention is drawn to what? This. Not this, right? To this. So that's an amazing thing that needs to be explained. The achievement gap needs to be explained. Why is it that we gave all this power and all these expectations to these people and government continued to grow? And the more government grew, the more it failed. And the more it failed, the more it grew. And so we just kept doing it. And so now there's this achievement gap and people are like, WTF? Right? Like, what's going on? The Austrian explanation for that was, well, I can't say it's because the politicians wanted to do that. I have to say that there must be an incongruence between the means that they've chosen and to achieve the ends that they've sought. So their ends are lofty. Eradicate social ills, poverty, ignorance, squalor, disease, and idleness. All right? We want to get rid of the social ills. The question is, what are the most effective means to obtain get rid of those social ills? So the Austrians relied on means-ends analysis. The engineers of social control, got the economics wrong. The socialists got the economics wrong. If the socialists had gotten economics right, or if socialist economics proved to be right, then Mises and Hayek, by commitment, would have had to have been socialists as scientists. They had to, because otherwise they would have violated their own strict value freedom, which was the definition of what it meant to be science, as opposed to the economists of the chair or whatever, right? The German historicists. Public choice people, on the other hand, said, okay, wait a minute. Why are people so persistently stupid? Right? Like, so I don't have to have super high cognitive capacity to say, if Pete wants to get out of this room, he's not going to keep trying to go through a wall, even if he believes that he has superpowers and he can go through a wall. Eventually, the wall's going to keep hitting up against him, or the refractory reality, and he's going to try to find the door and then go out the door. So what's going on with why it is that the inefficiencies persist? And they start asking hypotheses, which is, maybe we can infer intentions from outcomes, right? So this is the outcome of the policy. You, as a benevolent public interest explanation, find it to be shortfall, but maybe it never was intended to do that. Maybe it was intended all along to benefit a private party. And so now you had two different competing hypotheses. You had a public interest story, right, which is what Mises and Hayek had to be committed to in order to do the value freedom thing, or you had a private interest group story. And let's run the videotape. And so a lot of public choice was an examination of those various things. People like Wagner, Holcomb, and myself have devoted a large part of our career of squaring these two things, whereas people like, for example, Sandy Akita or Israel Kirzner stay strict. Public choice and Austrian economics don't align because they have different purposes. All right, and then there's also public choice people that say that Austrian economics has nothing to do with what they're doing because it's a different model. So there's these people in the middle. I would argue Buchanan was there as well. And the way that I would resolve this in the most pragmatic way is what I call in your kind of analysis, the rule of three. And this is what I mean. So for the first time, I take a stab. I look out there. I'm going to raise minimum wages. The government promises to raise minimum wage with the prospect it's going to help the least advantaged workers. And so they raise the minimum wage, and the least advantaged workers are not helped out. So their means are not effective with respect to those ends. So as an economic critic, I communicate that to them. Hey guys, your means are not, coherent with respect to those ends that you're seeking. All right, so then they still pass minimum wage. I try to restate what I just said with better evidence, with better argument, because I believe that I'm dealing with good faith partners. And if I can persuade them about the analytics and the empirics, then they're going to change their mind. So now I've taken 2 bites of the apple. If they come back again and they still pass minimum wage, then I can ask the question, well, maybe it is that you don't really want to improve the lot of the least advantaged. Maybe you want to improve the lot of these other workers. And therefore, I expose the private interest group story behind the legislation. Now, then, what do? That's just, again, a hypothesis, so then I got to study that. So, but it's not the case that they are separate from one another. They fold into one another. The very frustration with the failure to get across the means end story opens up another means end story we have to engage in. And we as theorists have to be, and scientists have to be open to that. So the Austrians and the public choice people go hand in hand. All right, so then the final thing that I wanted to talk about, that's the relationship between the Austrians and the public choice people, is, as I mentioned in the start, we're going back to the way political economy was practiced in its finest hours, from Adam Smith and David Hume to John Stuart Mill and John Baptiste Say, all right, but yet informed by the technical developments of neoclassical economics at the hands of Karl Menger and Böhm-Bawerk and Alfred Marshall and Frank Knight and Mises and Hayek and Knut Wicksell. Again, names up on that wall over there. One of my favorite ones is Philip Wicksteed. Wrote a fantastic book called The Common Sense of Political Economy. And it was reading Wicksteed that turned Henry Hazlitt into Henry Hazlitt. I don't know if I wrote a paper about Henry Hazlitt many years ago. Again, this common knowledge thing. Paul Samuelson became an economist because he read an article by Henry Hazlitt that was given to him in his freshman year class at the University of Chicago. Henry Hazlitt was the economics editor of the New York Times during the Great Depression. Just wrap your head around that. All right. When he left the New York Times, he got a paid full year to write Economics in One Lesson. Economics in One Lesson was a bestseller. It wasn't a cult classic, right? It was the Beatles, not like some underground, band. It's just that Henry Hazlitt lived a really, really long time, so that at the end of his life, the world had changed, right? And he had gotten older. And so after he left, his column, that then, by the way, who replaced him? Milton Friedman and Paul Samuelson. They had to hire both of them to replace Hazlitt, okay? So Hazlitt was a rather big deal. He was a genius that was forced into journalism by life circumstances. He was all set to go to advanced graduate school, like get to Harvard and things like that. His father had died and left money to the family. And what happened was his mom got snookered by a gigolo. It was her horse trainer. So she decided to pick up riding horses in New York City, high society, and the guy absconded with her funds. So then all of a sudden, Henry Hazlitt was 16 years old and didn't have really much of a future because it was lost to him. And so Hazlitt decided to go to school at night. He went to City University of New York, is where he went. It was free tuition. And he went there at night and while he had to work during the day. And he only did that for a year or so where he studied philosophy. But what's interesting is that Henry Hazlitt, at the age of 17, published his first book with a major publisher, and it's a book in philosophy. It's about thinking, all right? It was published by Dutton, which is a major house in New York City, and he was afraid to go there when they offered them the contract on the book because he thought when they saw such a young kid, they wouldn't give him the book contract. They wouldn't believe him, okay? I can tell a similar story about Pete Leeson, by the way. At a very young age, Pete Leeson had published an article in the local newspaper that Larry Reed read. And Pete grew up in Midland, Michigan, where the Mackinac Center and Larry Reed were at. And Larry Reed read this article, and he thought, oh my God, I have a professor in town who's like aligned with us. I need to get him involved in our stuff. And so he called the house. He tracked it down. It was the old days. You could, look in a yellow book and find somebody's number. And so he calls the house. And Pete, of course, was at school. And so Mrs. Leeson answered the phone. And he says, is Pete Leeson there? And she said, oh, no, he's at school. So again, Larry thinks, that, this is a professor, right? And so says to Mrs. Leeson, well, I read his article and I really would love to meet him. And of course, Mrs. Leeson's, thrilled. And so he's like, oh, I'm sure he would love to meet you too. And we're right here in Midland. And so they said, okay, well, let's have an appointment, set up. And so Pete came, he was all dressed up. He's 14 or 15 years old or whatever. And Larry came out and said, like, is this a joke? Like, no. And no, this is Pete. And so then they had to ask the lawyers first whether or not employing Pete would be a violation of U.S. Child labor laws. He ended up working for Mackinac throughout that time. So young geniuses, even in social sciences, can reveal themselves young. When I was that age, I wasn't thinking about any of these things at all. So what we're going to try to do is, again, get this perspective across. The reason why I was telling this story about Hazlitt is that because he couldn't go to school and couldn't go to work, he got a job in the next intellectual field that you would pick, which is journalism. He got a job as a runner on Wall Street. And when you're a runner on Wall Street, they used to produce the paper twice a day, right? Because that was the only source of information. You didn't have the kind of information that we even had once we got the ticker and everything else. They had to rely on the newspapers telling them. And he made a huge mistake. And his editor told him, you made that mistake, but if you make it again, we're going to have to fire you. So you better go learn some economics. And so he went to the local library, and he wanted to study economics. And he saw a book that was called The Common Sense of Political Economy. So why wouldn't I pick that book up? And so that's what he picked up and learned it. But I would highly recommend you guys to go over to the library here and pick up The Common Sense of Political Economy. If you can't pick it up, right, go to my colleague Tyler Cowan's book, and it's called Discover Your Inner Economist. And it's a very similar kind of treatment of things like Wicksteed did. But basically what it tries to tell you is that economics, when it's good, you should see yourself in the model. If you don't see yourself in the narrative being told by the economics, then you are not learning economics the right way. So when I talk about the goals of politicians, you got to see yourself. If you were in their shoes, you would make the same decisions, right? So politics becomes an active exchange, going back to this once we start examining things. And one of the things we find out is that the exchange takes place between rationally ignorant voters, specially interested voters, and rationally abstaining voters, and politicians who are vote seeking, okay, and campaign contribution seeking. So when they go out into the world and they knock on your door and they ask you to support them, if you disagree with them on a particular issue space, let's say one issue that's really passionate to you, and this politician stands for the opposite, they may agree with you on all the other ones, you're not going to pay attention to them. Many of you don't pay attention to politics. If I asked you to name like who your regional governor is, who this is, who that is, you don't pay attention to politics. You would be a rationally abstainer or rationally ignorant. And so who is the politicians going to benefit? They're going to benefit the specially interested voter, because that's the source of their votes and their campaign contributions. And so that's why we get a bias in politics to concentrate benefits on well-organized and well-informed and disperse costs on the unorganized and ill-informed. And it's more important, given the election cycle, to concentrate those benefits in the short term and disperse the costs in the long run. So I'm going to try to always pick financing strategies which push costs down the road, and benefit packages which give benefits right now. Okay, and so now I can sort of see this systematic bias in politics, and why it is that is very vulnerable to the knaves that Hume and Smith worried about. So what I try to do, build constitutional restrictions such that I minimize this kind of political football. That means I'm back again to these issues of what Hume and Smith and what Say and Mill and what Menger and Mises and Hayek and Knight and Buchanan all were talking about. Okay, so this is this is the reuniting of political economy and social philosophy once more, and the role that those play. And the way it comes out in Buchanan is what he calls constitutional political economy, right? And this will be my last thing, and we can open up for questions after this. So the way that Buchanan talks about constitutional political economy is that what I'm going to do is we're going to force the analysis to the rules level of analysis. And then economics is going to provide us the strategy analysis in given any kind of rules. And on the basis of that strategy and the way that plays out, it will either improve the game or not improve the game. And as a result, I'm going to then revise the rules to reflect that. So this year in baseball, in Major League Baseball, they're going to allow the players to challenge the umpire on balls and strikes because we now have computers. But there's a strategy to it, which is you can only challenge them so many times. You have to tap your head, and it has to be immediate, okay? It's going to be quite fascinating to study what the consequences of that are on the game, if any. A few years ago, in order to speed up baseball in America, they decided to put a pitching count on the pitchers. They want to try to get the games to be under 2 hours because the games were more like 3 hours and people didn't want to sit there for 3 hours. So they wanted to try to get the games to be under 2 hours. And so they sped up the pitchers. And, there was all kinds of concerns. So people are studying, what are the consequences of that? What are the strategies that result from it? A couple of years ago, they wanted to speed up the game. So when they went into extra innings, rather than playing, they put a guy on second to start. What is the consequences of that? In the old days, they decided to, it was a norm, not a written rule, but it was a norm if I was a pitcher that if someone beamed one of my teammates, that is hit them with the pitch, I was supposed to hit the next batter with a pitch. All right? There was a rule change. So in the American League, the pitchers still hit. In the National League, the pitchers didn't hit. They had a designated hitter. This existed for a long time. It's now across the board, but for a long time, that's how it was divided. When we did the studies on these things, which league had more pitchers hit, right, or batters hit, right? It was the one that had the designated hitter, because the pitcher never had to stand up to bat, so they ever had to face the consequences of their decision. There's accidents that happen. Incentives are tricky, right? There's accidents that happen when you have, in NASCAR, people have studied as we've gotten greater and greater safety. Did we actually end up by having greater safety or more head injuries because the drivers were more, careless or whatever? Right? These are all the kind of non-market factors that influence the decisions that go on that public choice is trying to get us to think about. Those are all within this strategy of the rules. But whenever there's a dysfunction, it's because the rules. And so if rules are the problem is an institutional failure, the solution is an institutional fix. And that was Buchanan's major point that he wanted to make, right? Was that we were going to do, and that was the way he brought the relationship between political economy and social philosophy back in. Social philosophy asks big questions. What is a good life? What is a good society? Buchanan's argument was, answer that question, what is a good society? That's going to imply a structure of rules. Those structure of rules are going to produce a set of incentives. So now let's study the consequences of those set of incentives. We'll call that strategy. That's political economy. The basis of that is going to tell us whether or not that's truly a good society. Because dreams, aspirations, are not actually necessarily good if they can't ever be achieved. So it's all about this issue of closing the achievement gap by thinking through the relationship between institutions and the strategies that players are going to play in the political and economic game, given those rules. And that's how we work our way towards the good society. And so I hope, you guys are about a month into the class, is that right? Yeah. So I hope that at some point you'll be able to get a chance to If you haven't already, read Buchanan's Nobel lecture or Eleanor Ostrom's Nobel lecture, because it is all about this issue of how I can change the rules and that can change the outcomes of things. And yeah, so I'll end there and take any kind of questions people have.